introduction to chapter 8 gave you an insight into what we are going to study. When we look at life around us, we can observe variety and we also observe similarities. We need to understand these two characteristics of life in order to understand evolution. Genetic variation refers to the differences between individuals or differences between population. It is a term used to describe the variation in DNA sequence in each of our genomes. Genetic variation makes us all unique. It may be in terms of hair color, skin color, or even the shape of our faces. Individuals of a species have similar characteristics, but they are rarely identical. The differences between them is called variation. Genetic variation is important in evolution. Evolution relies on genetic variation that is passed down from one generation to the next. The favorable characteristics are selected and are passed on. This is called natural selection. Genetic variation is caused by mutation, random mating between organisms, random fertilization, or by crossing over. Of these, the first three factors reshuffle genes within a population, giving the offspring a combination which differs from parents. Variation allows some individuals within a population to adapt to the changing environment. Some new genes increase the organism's ability to survive and reproduce. Therefore, genetic variation is advantageous. Genetics as a scientific discipline stemmed from the work of Gregor Johann Mendel in the middle of the 19th century. Mendel was an Austrian monk who discovered the basic principles of heredity through his experiments in his garden. Mendel's observations became the foundation of modern genetics and the study of heredity. He is widely considered a pioneer in the field of genetics. He did his experiments on the garden pea. His experiments showed that inheritance of certain traits in pea plant follows particular patterns. Why did Mendel choose the pea plant? Mendel chose the pea plant because of its many distinct varieties. It is an annual plant with a short life cycle, so several generations can be studied within a short period. It has perfect bisexual flowers which contain both male and female parts. The flowers are predominantly self-pollinating, so it is easy to get a pure line for several generations. Pea plants are easy to cross-pollinate because pollen from one plant can be introduced to the stigma of another plant after removing the anthers. Pea plant produces large number of seeds in one generation. Pea plants can be easily raised, maintained, and handled. A number of easily detectable contrasting characters were available. Mendel selected 7 pairs of contrasting characters of pea plants for his experiments. Each of these characteristics had 2 forms. The characters included height, seed shape, pod shape, color of the flower, color of the seed, and position of the flower. Mendel allowed the plants to self-fertilize and he verified the purity. Example, tall plants gave rise only to tall offsprings. All the 7 characteristics were consistent in the generation after generation of self-fertilization. These parental lines could be considered homozygous. Self-pollination happens before the flower opens, so progeny were produced from a single parent. Mendel then crossed the pure breeding lines of plants and recorded the traits of the hybrid progeny. Peas can also be cross-pollinated by hand by simply opening the flower buds to remove the stamen and dust the pollen from one plant to the stigma of another plant. He found that all the first generation or F1 hybrids looked like one of the parent plant. Example, when purple and white flowers were crossed, the progeny was purple. However, when he allowed hybrid plants to self-pollinate, the hidden traits appeared in the second generation, that is the F2 generation. These were the F2 hybrids. Mendel described each of these trait variants as dominant or recessive traits. F1 dominant traits appeared in the F1 hybrids, example purple color, whereas recessive trait did not appear in the F1 generation. Mendel found that in the F2 generation there were 3 dominant and 1 recessive traits, that is 3:1 ratio. Recessive traits appeared in the F2 generation. Mendel did something more than anything else, which marks the birth of modern genetics. He counted the number of plants with each phenotype. This procedure had never been used in studies on inheritance before Mendel's work. Indeed, others had obtained similar results in breeding studies, but they failed to count the number in each class. Mendel counted 705 purple flowered plants and 224 white flowered plants. He noted that the ratio of 705:224 is almost exactly as 3:1 ratio. Mendel repeated the crossing procedures for the 6 other pairs of P character differences. He found the same 3:1 ratio in the F2 generation for each pair. By this time, he was beginning to believe in the significance of the 3:1 ratio, and he began to seek an explanation for it. In all cases, one parental phenotype disappeared in the F1 generation and reappeared in 1/4 of the F2 generation. The white phenotype, for example, was completely absent in the F1 generation but reappeared in 1/4 of the F2 plants. Is the white phenotype not expressed in the F1 plants? Mendel used the terms dominant and recessive to describe this phenomenon without explaining the mechanism. The purple phenotype is dominant to the white phenotype and the white phenotype is recessive to purple. Mendel went on to show that in the case of F2 individuals which are showing dominant phenotype, there were in fact 2 genetically distinct subclasses. To prove this case, he was working with seed color. The seed colors that Mendel used were yellow and green. He crossed a pure yellow line with a pure green line and observed that the F1 piece that appeared were all yellow. Therefore, by definition, yellow is the dominant phenotype and green is recessive. Yellow is represented with capital Y and green with small y. Mendel started cross-fertilizing pure breeds having contrasting characters. Cross-pollinating a pure breed of yellow and green gave the following results. The first filial generation or the F1 generation had all yellow seeds, all yellow pea seeds. These pea plants, further on self-pollination, they gave a second generation, that is F2 generation. In the F2 generation, 75% yellow seed peas and 25% green peas were obtained. In the F2 generation also, Mendel self-pollinated F2 plants and he observed the F3 generation. In the F3 generation, he found out that a set of peas gave only yellow seed giving pea plants. Another observation was that 50% of the yellow seed giving plants gave about 3/4 yellow and 1/4 green seed giving pea plants. The third observation was that 25% of green pea plants gave only green seed giving pea plants. From these observations, Mendel made some assumptions. The first assumption is that every pea plant has 2 factors responsible for producing a particular trait. These factors are what we now call as genes. In our example of yellow and green peas, the pure breed parents will have the factors of the same type. A pure breed yellow seed giving pea plant will have the factors of the same type denoted by capital Y. A pure breed green seed giving pea will have both the factors of the same type denoted by small y. The second assumption is that during reproduction, one factor, that is one gene from each parent, is taken to form a new pair in the progeny. Assumption 3. One of these will always dominate the other in terms of expression of a trait. If they are mixed together, only one will dominate. The trait which get expressed in the F1 generation is called the dominant. The one which is not expressed in the F1 generation is called the recessive. Example, if capital Y factor and small y factor come together, the capital Y factor will dominate. Then the pea seeds will always be yellow in color. From assumption 2 that reproduction will involve factor from each parent, we should understand that the breed after cross pollination will have one factor capital Y and one factor small y. That is, all the peas will have paired factor capital Y and small y, and the expression in F1 generation will be yellow. By assumption 3, that the dominant one is expressed, capital Y will be expressed, so they will all be yellow. So based on these observations from several other experiments, Mendel came up with a general observation which we now call as Mendel's laws, which we will try to understand in our next video.